Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next update to the Canadian federal election prediction series. So, obviously, we are far away from the next election. The earliest possible election would be probably April 2023 with the budget. The NDP break ranks to vote it down, or potentially 2024. If it's neither of those Aprils, it will I guess April 2025 is a possibility too. If it's not 2023 or 2024, I really suspect it would be on the regular fixed date of October 2025, with the sole exception of Justin Trudeau or Liberals if they get a new leader. There's some speculation on that in that time period, and they think they might be able to do better in a snap election. They might call a snap election. Right now, it seems unlikely, but who knows? Things change. This is politics. Nothing is constant. Everything's moving. But we don't know. So that's why I'm continuing doing these. Like, we could be very far away from an election, but we could also have one in a few months. So we never know. So we're doing an update. So what has changed? So notably, there's a couple. Some of these places are going to move relatively fluctuating. So like not that exciting. Like BC over here, always going to see some fluctuation here. The Conservatives lost 2 seats, and the NDP and Liberals picked up 1. Not that exciting. Liberals and NDP have picked up 1 and 2 for the Liberals, 1 for the NDP in Alberta. Basically, they're just holding the ground they got in 2021 election. In Ontario, the NDP and the Liberals NDP losing 1 seat, Liberals are losing 2, and the Conservatives picking up all 3. Quebec, Conservatives are losing 2, Liberals are getting 1, Bloc's getting 1. In Atlantic Canada, this is where some interesting things have happened since the last update. New Brunswick is now leaning blue. We'll see in a minute when I go to popular votes, but it's slightly conservative popular vote, and the Conservatives picking up a seat there. Similarly, they are picking up 2 seats in Nova Scotia from the Liberals and 3 seats in Newfoundland from the Liberals, which is quite big, and it is very close in Newfoundland. Technically, the Liberals are more than 2 percentage points ahead, so they're not within margin of error popular vote, but I guess most of rural Newfoundland is flipping blue, according to this projection. PEI remains constant because PEI is PEI, and the ridings are very uniform. I suspect at this point in time, if the Conservatives, because they're really the only other party that has a chance, were to win seats in PEI, it's very likely they'd either win 1 or all 4. There's very little room for like 2 or 3. It's pretty much 1 or 4. So, there's that. So that's really the overall changes on a grand scheme. But, well, we're going to pan over here to an Excel spreadsheet. So, the last update was this May 22nd one. And notably, Atlantic Canada here, the Liberals had a 6 percentage point lead, well, 6.5. They have now been reduced to merely 2.5 percentage point lead in Atlantic Canada. The NDP is gaining a bit of ground. The Greens gain a little bit of ground. People's Party gain a little bit of ground. Conservatives gain some ground. This is huge. This is a very big thing. In Ontario, things are a bit more complicated. Technically, the Conservatives are gaining seats, but they're actually losing vote share, and the Liberals are gaining vote share. But they are doing better in rural areas, and they're doing worse in very urban areas like Toronto. Well, part of this, and I will note, because you might be looking at this and be like, May 2020, or the 22nd of May update, they had 36%, now they're at 35%. What the heck? Well, in the model, because of the result of the Ontario election, I have now started considering population density of riding, because I think that was one of the biggest skews for seat projection accuracy. So I'm now considering that. Obviously, I don't really have anything to calibrate until October, likely, when the Quebec election occurs. But until then, where we are, we'll have calibration later in the future. But that has changed a bit. That is why some of the seat changes we're seeing here we'll go back to this. Some of the sea changes on this map compared to the last one in the last update, a lot of these are a result of adding density into consideration, and in the particular case of Atlantic Canada, a huge surge or huge drop in Liberal support. But notably, places like Alberta, in BC, the NDP and Liberals are doing slightly better in the urban areas. And I've also done a change on how I'm considering the territories. The territories are never pulled. Straight up, they're never pulled separately. They are usually lumped in with BC, not always. So I am doing a slightly different projection for the territories, because the last election, not that it mattered because it's only 3 seats, but the last Canadian election, I was very off on the territories. I had a huge error there. So I'm thought of something, a different way to handle them. And this different method of handling the territories yields the Yukon to the Conservatives. It is plausible because the Yukon is typically the most conservative territory. But I don't know. It's kind of it's a bit sketchy in the air there, so I don't know. Now, I will note there was a Main Street / iPolitics poll, or, well, iPolitics paid for a Main Street poll the other day, and I technically do have access to it. I don't know if it's paywalled, so I'm not going to go too much into detail for it, but I have excluded that poll. Main Street has adopted a new polling method. They seem to have gone all online. And not wanting to divulge results from the poll because, well, let's just say this. Or not wanting to divulge results because I'm not sure if it's paywalled or not, and I'm not sure if that would be violating subscriber agreements or anything. But I don't really trust the result of the poll. It seems extremely off what every other poll is right now. So I have ignored that poll. But overall, there seems to be a narrowing of polling, the margins here, to a solid conservative lead. Nanos keeps reporting, is reporting more conservative leads. Leisure had a poll recently where they had a conservative lead. The margin of lead varies, but they all report a conservative lead. Notably as well, Nanos and Leisure are reporting large leads in Atlantic Canada for the Conservatives. If that continues, you might actually see Newfoundland here, maybe Nova Scotia, maybe PEI, definitely New Brunswick, in more blue. Let's go back here to check for a second. So at this point, the Conservatives have a 1.1 percentage point lead in New Brunswick, and they're only down 4.3 in Nova Scotia, 8.7 in PEI, and just shy of 2.7 in Newfoundland. So they closed the gap quite a bit, and they might close it even more. It depends on if that trend holds. Now, I cannot name specifically why this has happened. My working theory is Atlantic Canada, the most recent inflation numbers show, is having one of the hardest hit by inflation here. I believe Nova Scotia had, and PEI in particular, have the highest inflation rate in the country, among other things. Halifax, Nova Scotia in particular, has been hit very hard by the growing housing crisis in Canada, and I believe the same thing is true in New Brunswick, from a couple people I know from New Brunswick, but not being able to verify that myself, because I guess I could look at numbers for that, but not having thought to look at numbers for that, I can't 100% vouch that, but with that in mind, well, it is what it is. It does seem like there is a creeping housing crisis there. PEI, Newfoundland, not sure about. But I think these things are starting to hurt the Liberals particularly. And another thing in Nova Scotia, this would not have likely had an effect yet, but it likely will, is the interference of the feds, particularly the RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, into the investigation for the Portapique shooting. I suspect that is going to really alienate and anger parts of rural Nova Scotia. It might not affect the Liberals directly. It depends on what parts of rural Nova Scotia get really angsty. If it's really just Portapique area gets really upset, that's not going to affect them because the riding Portapique is in voted Conservative last election. So that might not directly affect them, but if it spills over to other parts of rural Nova Scotia or even Halifax, that could be quite bad. I know personally, myself and many people I know are pretty incensed about this, considering the whole thing. Nova Scotians are not quite as raw as we were 2 years ago. But, still a pretty big deal and still a colossal screw-up on the part of the feds. And this makes it even worse. So I think that is all of these things are contributing factors to going on in the Maritimes drifting away from the Liberals. Because again, right now, the Conservatives have only gained 1.5 percentage points since the last update. So they're gaining a bit of ground, but it's mostly the Liberals losing ground, losing nearly 3 percentage points. It's mostly them losing ground. A little bit Conservatives gaining ground, but mostly the Liberals losing ground. And I think that's a big part of the reason. And it really does seem, overall, in news and just opinion from people, that the Liberals the brand is getting very damaged nationally. Between the fallout of the Emergencies Act inquiry, rampant inflation, and a couple other things. They had a bunch of ministers that have done really dumb things, like the foreign minister allowed bureaucrats to go to celebrate Russia Day at the Russian embassy. A bit awkward considering, technically speaking, the federal government of Canada recognizes the war in Ukraine as a genocidal war. I personally think that's was bad. It was inappropriate for the government to call that a genocidal war. In my opinion, it does not appear to be a genocidal war to me. It looks like a fratricidal war, but that's a different thing altogether. And it seems inappropriate to call everything we don't like genocide, but that's a whole other question altogether. But considering the line of the federal government is a genocidal war, sending someone to celebrate Russia Day is deeply inappropriate and embarrassing, really. It kind of shows that what we call genocide apparently doesn't matter. That's one of my main gripes, having that war labeled as a genocidal war, for the record. But anyways. So, there's a lot going on in Canada. I don't know how much is filtering it down to the average person. If you're watching this video, given my subscriber count, given the view counts I get, you are almost certainly more politically active than everybody else. If you were the kind of person watching this content. But the people who don't watch this kind of stuff or watch equivalent channels, there's all sorts of them. I mean, not many for Canada, but there's many channels that exist that cover stuff like this. You guys probably have a better idea of the stuff going on, and I think this is really going to affect things. Especially since we seem to be on the brink of a recession overall, partially brought on because of our sanctions against Russia, partially brought on by rampant inflation, partially brought on by the central bank raising interest rates. All of these things are contributing, and it's very likely you will see a recession. In fact, if Q1, I think we're going to be seeing Q1 numbers, because what's Q1 would be April, May, June. So when we see Q1 numbers at the end of this quarter for GDP, I will be shocked if it's not already negative. And certainly Q2 is going to be negative. I do not see a single world where interest rates are going to keep going up, because it's already 1.5% central bank rate. And you look at even things like cars right now. My buddy bought a car recently. The lowest interest rate was 4 and a bit percent that he could get for the car. I bought a similar model of car in 2020. I was getting 1.99%. So right there, cars are already twice as the interest rates are doubled. Mortgage rates are also quite high now. I think they're 5% now. Well, I mean, it depends on the bank, depends on your credit rating, all that stuff. But the lowest it is I believe 5%. The floor is now 5%. So all this stuff is going up, and I think it's only a matter of time before that's going to cause, if it hasn't already, economic downturn into a recession. Now, where this will go is another question altogether. And this is the most important factor here, right? If we have a recession, that will determine the next action to political parties. And if we have a depression, which is potentially possible, that also affects things. I suspect if we get to a point where we are in a depression, which correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I'm pretty sure it's 4 quarters of negative growth. I think at that point, the NDP non-confidence votes. Singh may or may not, but I think the backbencher NDPs will revolt. Because at that point, considering everything, that can only be Trudeau's fault. He's been in government but 4 quarters from now, will have been in government for close to 8 years, and the economy will have crashed. And a lot of the reason our economy is going to crash, Trudeau's government is going to blame the war in Russia and supply chain issues. One of the biggest reasons is irresponsible spending during COVID. Specifically, the central bank takes a huge amount of blame for this too. The inflation of M1 money supply by the central bank buying federal bonds, which I don't know why that's even legal, but that's a whole other question for a whole other day. The central bank buying government bonds, and then the government helicoptering that cash to people. We all know this by now. The numbers are in. CERB went overwhelmingly to people who didn't need it. Now, one of the largest groups who got it were university students, specifically of wealthy families. I mean, I don't like to throw this out, but I mean, if the government is throwing out money, you're going to take the money. I used the student version of CESPA, or of CERB. I did not need it, but it was there, and I could take it, so I took it. That's how everyone works, right? Call me a hypocrite, I guess. I don't know. But if the government is throwing out helicopter money, it's kind of in my opinion, you should exploit it. Exploit the system, because then one day they might fix the system. If you never exploit it, then it's not going to be fixed. And the system is dumb in the case of CERB, so it should be exploited. That is my opinion. Comment below if you disagree. But myself and a bunch of other people I know, they benefited from it. They did not need it. It did not help them. In fact, it helped me finance a car, which, I mean, what was the point of that? Why are we throwing out money to help random students who have families who are willing to support them? And at the time, I also got a job pretty much immediately at graduation. So, in the middle of COVID. So, it was just all nonsense. And I know a lot of people like this. I'm not alone. I know plenty of people. Literally dozens. What was one of this? And you look at the aggregate data, not even just this anecdotal data. There's tons of... The data is overwhelmingly wasted helicopter money. It went to rich people or rich kids or families who had other incomes. And the people who were actually hurt by this did not get much. The money disproportionately went to rich people, or the scions of rich people. Rich households, I suppose, is a better way to say it. And the people who hurt the most by the lockdowns were working class service industry workers. And they didn't get the equal percentage. For the amount of wages they lost, they did not get an equivalent amount from the government. The government screwed them on one end and screwed them on the other end. And all this helicopter cash has directly hurt everybody here because it has inflated the economy between the federal budget overspending, stimulating demand, and the central bank printing more money, increasing the money supply, i.e. devaluing the money, because they increased way, 50% increase of the monetary supply when our GDP decreased. That's the opposite of what you're supposed to do, central bank. Slap them in the face. Dumb. So, All these things are contributing together to cause economic crisis. You spend too much money, you print too much money, both are inflationary. You look at Canada. Our inflation rate was already inappropriately high before Russia-Ukraine. And it has since then. Yes, sure, Russia-Ukraine probably has a decent effect on maybe food, but really Canada shouldn't be that affected by food prices from Russia-Ukraine. We don't import food from them, at least as far as I'm aware. So that shouldn't be affecting us too much. And more importantly, bear with me a second. The oil and gas prices are definitely gone up by them. Largely because we have anti-oil and gas governments who have curtailed our ability to produce this stuff domestically, ignoring all possible considerations for that. Yes, that is true. We look at other things. Russia-Ukraine, that has no effect on used cars. Used cars, my buddy bought a car the other day, right? I just mentioned that. Well, technically bought it months ago, but it got delivered yesterday. The car he got delivered, brand new, from the dealership. The used variant of that car cost the same as buying it new. That's not Russia, Ukraine. Sure, maybe you could argue that supply lines. Maybe. But at the same time, a lot of that is still due to excess money thrown into the economy, more than it can sustain. A lot of the pressure on food prices, same thing. Canada exports food. Food prices should not be that unstable in Canada for external concerns. Yes, some things like, let's say, oranges, it might be unstable, but we're not talking about specifically oranges or specifically pineapples or particular foods that are not grown in large quantities in Canada. We're talking about basic crap like bread. Canada grows places like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, they grow tons of wheat. In Ontario, tons and tons and tons and tons of wheat. Why are where bread price is drastically increasing? The monetary supply inflation, the demand inflation. This isn't foreign problems. Housing. Housing has nothing to do with foreign countries. It has nothing to do with supply line issues. What do you use to build a house? Maybe screws are being affected, but screws are a negligible part of a house. And I've not heard of a single person being like, oh, we don't have enough screws to build houses. Not heard of that. Lumber went up, but, well, Canada creates a bunch of lumber. If lumber prices went up, that's really a result of bad COVID policies, which is the Fed's problem, or the province's problem potentially, but it is a government problem, either way. Similarly, housing prices going up insane amounts, that's the government's problem. They have created a system where that is happening. Combination, not entirely, but a combination of foreign buyers, artificially low interest rates, helicoptering cash to people, not constructing enough homes, having hundreds of thousands of immigrants come into the country. All of these things, these 5 things together, are why we have a huge housing problem. Each one individually, not a big deal. 5 together is catastrophic. And this is not all. Like, there's so many economic problems that have been caused by the current administration. And to be honest, a lot of the provinces are also to blame. Not all of them. Like, I'm of the opinion that premiers like Houston have less to blame than premiers like Doug Ford, to name 2. are more to blame for a lot of the domestic problems. Not all of them. Again, feds have a lot of blame. But, for example, Houston's only been in power since August 2021, so he has less to blame than people who have been in power for the entirety of COVID, who implemented a lot of these COVID rules. Because a lot of these COVID rules were unscientific and illogical. They didn't work, at least nominally. And most of the rules are justified, at least in Nova Scotia, were justified on our healthcare system couldn't support not having them. If the healthcare system is imposing everybody have to suffer locking down because it can't handle the burden of sick people, something's wrong with your healthcare system. Your healthcare system should be able to take a large influx of sick people. Maybe we would need to have emergency tent cities set up, or hospital ships, for example, in some places have suggested those. Things like that, that's potentially fine. But the problem wasn't that we couldn't increase capacity because of buildings or beds or whatever. The problem is we didn't have enough people. We didn't have enough testing resources. We didn't have enough ancillaries that you need to actually deliver the healthcare. We didn't have those, so we couldn't do them. That's the problem. All these things together. The important thing here is this is what is going to cause Trudeau's government deep harm. All these things are contributing to the recession. Almost certainly going to happen. We're looking at places like the US, almost certainly going to have a recession. Just inept policies on many levels of government. Not a single person is to blame. Many levels of government, many people have colossally screwed up. And they all should be held accountable. All be elected out. There's very few incumbents that I think did a good job. Some did. Like, for example, Ron DeSantis in Florida, I think, did a great job. Florida had very little economic impact and about average mortality rate in the US. That is a great job. Places in Canada, very few did good. I'm not really... Maybe Saskatchewan, I'm not 100% certain, so if you're from Saskatchewan, maybe let me know in the comments below. But I feel like Saskatchewan did an okay job, but a lot of the provinces, terrible. Quebec, absolute despotism. What the heck was a curfew supposed to do, other than oppress people? What's going on, Legault? A recession, though. Well, bad. And I think will doom the Liberals in 2025. I don't think will cause an early election. Recessions happen, but NDP's probably not going to revolt from that. Singh's not going to betray him. I think Singh's just going in for the... I think Singh's accepted that he's going to either get removed from NDP leader or lose his seat next election. So he's just going for his pension. Because I believe he's up for pension in September or October of 2025. So that's my suspicion here. I don't think his coalition agreement has anything to do with more what he thinks is good for Canadians. I'm pretty sure he's doing it just because it will give him the chance to get his pension. The real risk for Trudeau is if either a meltdown from real estate causing a depression, or the U.S. economy completely blowing up and having a recession, or a depression as a result, causing us to get a depression. Those are the two possibilities. And I do not think we should underestimate the possibility that the U.S. economy could explode. I think it's not particularly likely yet, but a lot could happen. The U.S. economy is not healthy at all. The U.S. has an incredible eye-watering amount of debt as a percentage of GDP. Ours is bad, but theirs is eye-watering. And they're throwing more and more money out. You look at places like Europe, Japan, they're also deeply, eye-wateringly in debt. And they've all printed a silly amount of money as well. And I think we also have a very real risk here. This wouldn't technically be a recession or a depression. Like, okay, technically it is. this would cause a depression. But if China goes in and invades Taiwan, which I cannot predict if it will happen, I can just tell you it looks more likely than ever that it could happen. I cannot predict the future, so I don't know if it is going to happen, but they have done actions to make it easier for them to do it. So it's very possible. If that occurs, that would cause effectively a global depression, but it wouldn't be a depression like 1929. This would be a depression not because people lost a ton of money on the stock market and there's bank runs. This would be a depression because the entire basis of the modern economy will cease to function. The semiconductor supply will be gone. That is the real risk. If that happens, specifically the war in Taiwan happens, I don't know if we'll get an election. I feel like people won't want to throw an election on purpose into wartime. But if any of the other depressions occur, I think Trudeau's done. I think the NDP backbenchers, I think, will revolt. Possibly some liberal backbenchers, too, because there's been some discussion that Trudeau's losing popularity in his caucus. Apparently, many liberals think he is holding them back. We will see. There is also the potential that Trudeau could step down. The talk of this is getting hotter in speculation in the media, though take some media speculation for a grain of salt. Doesn't really mean much, but it is getting hotter, and there is getting more of it. So it is a potential concern. I think there's only been one prime minister who's ever won 4 consecutive elections, and they were much more popular than Trudeau is. Trudeau is very unpopular. His base likes him, and no one else does. But the problem is his base appears to be shrinking election over election. So if his base keeps shrinking and the Conservatives can rebound either or under one of the next leaders, that could be easily lost election right there. Right now, actually, with these seat totals, if an election did occur and this result occurs, I actually think the Conservatives would form a minority government, because if you look at these numbers here, you need 170 seats for a majority for confidence. The Greens, NDP, and Liberals cannot get enough for confidence. The Bloc holds the balance. And I strongly suspect, given the choice, Blanchet would much rather prefer to support a Conservative minority over a Liberal one. Now, would that actually happen? I don't know. Because you don't necessarily get it. The Conservatives wouldn't necessarily get a chance. It depends on Blanchet. But I suspect strongly, especially if Blanchet keeps trying to stay cozy with CAQ voters and Legault himself, that Blanchet would rather support the Conservative minority. So right now, if the election were to occur, I think the most likely result is a Conservative minority government under Bergen. Now, realistically, we're probably not going to see an election until next April, so it would probably be a Conservative minority government under Poilievre with the current seat totals. Though, realistically, I think since for previous videos on the channel, Poilievre is dominating the Conservative leadership race. As I know in the future I'll have an update for that, but I won a few more polls. I only had gained one since then. But assuming Poilievre wins, I think the only two options are either the Conservative Party is going to gain a huge swell in support or it's going to crater. I'm really leaning towards it's going to gain support. Like, don't misinterpret me here. He's very likely to gain support nationally. But it's not impossible that he could lose support. It depends, because you look at things like, I just read a poll recently about the Freedom Convoy, as, well, it turned out not very popular among a lot of people, unfortunately. But the catch there is, I think, this is my suspicion, because the numbers don't say this either way, that the people who don't like the Freedom Convoy are people who would never vote Conservative anyways, so it doesn't matter, right? It goes back to the age-old thing I beat my head on every single time I talk on this channel since 2021. The Conservatives under O'Toole flopping on guns in the 2021 election is what made them lose, because people who want gun control would never vote for the Conservative Party ever. They will never do it. If gun control is a big issue for you, I'm not saying you're one of those people who's like, well, I think there should be some gun control. I mean the people who are like, we need more gun control. If more gun control was a big concern for you, you were never, ever going to vote Conservative. So there's no point in appealing to you. And the people who are like, well, I think some gun control should exist, they're not very hardliners. They probably don't care that much if you just justify it. But anyways, that's a topic I hash out too much because it really annoys me personally. A lot of time politicians seem just, or their advisors giving them the advice, though ultimately falls on the politician, seem just so comically inept and unable to understand this stuff. Like, it's an election. Some people won't vote for you. That's the fact. Like, appealing for someone who's never going to vote for you is pointless. The socialist is never going to vote for the the Conservatives. A libertarian's never going to vote for the NDP. But these are demographics that there's not even really a point courting. Courting someone for the sake of getting their vote oftentimes is actually a bad strategy, because even if you get their vote, you will lose other votes. The best way to win an election is to have a strong, clear vision and to argue to everybody why your vision is a good vision. There's going to be people who will never vote for you. Never. Never, 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 never. There's never been an election in a free democracy, or a free democratic system, in the case of the US, where a party won 100% of the votes. It's never happened. It will never happen. It's literally impossible. You could put 100 people in a room, and they will never all agree on the same thing. But politicians seem to forget that. I'm going to cut this off here. So, comment below what you thought of the video. If you think, what do you think the odds of a depression are, recession, or any future elections? Let me know what you think of the new map. I got a higher res version of this and edited it, so it looks nicer, maybe, hopefully. Let me know. And if you liked the video, press that like button. It really helps the channel. Press subscribe if you want to keep in touch on these kind of things. Woo, woo, woo. If you want to follow me on Twitter, keep up to date with what channel's doing, follow me up at Bagel Polling. And otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you later this week with more stuff.